Hello and welcome to part 3 of this series on writing a paper with the JRA in mind. Cliff Studman here again to take you through the construction of a paper. The general aim here is that you should be able to decide where any paragraph or sentence fits within the overall structure of a paper and to write paragraphs accordingly. It helps a lot if you know the differences between sections, such as analysis and discussion, for example. And so you'll need to know the sections and their purposes as per these objectives. Be warned, this section can get a bit technical in parts. You may want to pause or repeat different slides or take notes as you listen. Just use your computer controls accordingly. So let's get into the detail about the makeup of a paper. Now, all the necessary information needs to be somewhere, and the paper structure is designed so that the reader can find the information he or she wants. So it must be where the reader expects to find it. If it's in the wrong place, the reader, e.g. the reviewer, may not see it. In this respect, it is no different from a typical research proposal. What follows is a general guide. In principle, it doesn't matter what category of paper you are presenting, it will follow a similar structure, and most papers will contain material which would fit under these headings. However, all papers will vary in content and emphasis, and some sections may be smaller or larger, and may be subsumed into other sections. The main aim is to make your paper clear and concise, and the following framework will help to organise your thinking, even if the final result involves merging sections together in some other way. We will give examples of how it works for other categories of paper later in this webinar, after we have covered the main sections. Your peer advisor will help with getting things in the right place and with the overall structure of your particular paper, especially if you write under these headings. In webinar part 2, we describe just 4 main sections in any paper: background, history, actions, and outcomes. Now let's see how that works out in practice. The standard structure of a paper is title, including author affiliations, abstract, keywords, introduction, methods, results, analysis, discussion, conclusions, referencing, acknowledgements, and for the JRA, a mini bio about yourself. This is straightforward to apply in the case of a research study. However, it applies to other categories of paper as well, with slight adjustments. Your peer advisor will help you to arrange your early drafts into a more readable fashion if you try to distinguish the different components, at least initially. You should also end up with a more logical and well thought out piece of work. Remember to check the journal's style and format by studying the guide for authors, and also by looking over past issues before you write your paper. One useful way to think about it is that your paper tells a story in which you reveal the story bit by bit in a logical fashion. We will start with the introduction and come back to things like the abstract and title format later. The introduction of a paper is the who, what, why, when and where section. It sets the scene for the research you are about to describe. Your first sentence should capture your reader's attention by stating clearly and concisely the problem you're addressing. To get to more specific details, the introduction explains what the paper is about and its context. It explains briefly why you decided to do the research, leading logically to the objectives. Later, the literature review will justify your decisions. It will usually include some or all of the items we will describe in the next few slides. However, they would appear in the form of a continuous narrative rather than as subheadings. Let's look at the why first. The why describes the problem and can be explained through a problem statement. It explains why you are working on this subject and should provide information such as the following: problem identification, what's wrong; background, what is the context; Next, one considers its significance. Why does it matter to research administrators? Seriousness? How big a problem is it? Consequences. What happens if the problem continues? Knowledge gaps. What's known and what is not currently known about the problem? Usually, the introduction will outline rather than justify the problem. That comes later when you get to a detailed literature review. Who, when and where are just stating briefly the time of the research, where it was conducted and who was involved in broad terms rather than individuals. No research project covers everything and inevitably there are limitations. You may have a project that deals with issues in PUIs, i.e. primarily undergraduate universities, for example. Therefore, it is important to be clear about the scope of your study. You will need to outline the specific circumstances of your research, what is out as well as in, e.g. applies to private research companies rather than universities. The aim should be to keep these details short but complete. Who involves not just the researchers or the institution, but should also consider who will implement the results. Who will need to do what, and how will they know about it? Studies on the uptake of research findings tell us that it is a very good thing to engage with the potential users and implementers right from the start. They may be able to suggest things that will make your study stronger. Asking who implements the findings leads to the question of who should you be talking to about this right now? Now let's talk about the what of the study. This can be stated in various ways. Firstly, you can write research objectives or aims of the project. Second, you can ask key research questions. Or thirdly, you can hypothesize. Each way can guide you in many aspects of the study, such as your choice of literature to review, the methodology you use, and how you structure and focus your paper. I find it very helpful to try to formulate my paper by writing out all three forms. It helps me focus on just what I'm trying to tell people in my paper. However, I would only use at most one of the three methods in the actual paper, if any, whichever made the most sense in the context of the paper itself. And sometimes I might not use any of these in the final version. So, let's look at each method briefly. First, using research objectives. Ideally, they should be SMART objectives, as you probably know: specific, measurable, attainable, relevant and timely. Although this may not work so well for reflective inquiries or other types of study that do not follow the traditional scientific method. The main aim objective is a statement of what the research project is seeking to achieve. E.g., we want to see if happiness amongst staff will reduce the time from notification of project funding to getting the research go-ahead. Specific objectives are subsets of the main objective, e.g., to determine how to measure happiness in a research office, or to find out how happy research administrators are, or to determine if this makes a difference in the time from notification of project funding to getting the research go-ahead. Alternatively, you can formulate your what as a set of questions that are related to the specific objectives. Examples: are research administrators happier than other people? How do you measure happiness in a research office? Does it make a difference? What happens if? Hypothesizing is a third approach. This is a set of very specific ideas or statements you want to test out. E.g., people with blue eyes get more research grants than people with green eyes. Of course, not every study has hypotheses. For example, it is unlikely that an exploratory study using a qualitative approach would have any. The same applies to reflective inquiries and other types of article. Sometimes you may need to define clearly the key concepts involved. In a very technical or methods-intensive area, this is particularly important. Now, acronyms. As a non-American, I often struggle with acronyms that are familiar to most Americans. Remember, journals are intended for a worldwide audience, and NIH may not mean much to a non-American. So, for example, we use the CIA, that is the Culinary Institute of America, or my favourite, UK, which of course stands only for the University of Kentucky, according to my very good friends from that part of the world. Make sure you give the full meaning of every abbreviation or acronym the first time you use it. Thereafter, the initials are just fine. There are several things the introduction does not contain. It does not describe the methods you used, and you should not describe the results or the outcomes. You certainly won't be discussing the results or drawing conclusions. You might want to express what you hope the research will achieve, but more in a general way, such as, this research is highly relevant to compliance managers and may lead to better performance. But even this sort of comment is usually more appropriate in the discussion section later. Let's move on to the literature review. You will need to have done a lit review, and this normally comes after or within the introduction, depending on its size and importance. The lit review provides factual evidence as to why the research is necessary and confirms what was outlined previously. Some people are not sure how to do a lit review. It involves collecting titles and abstracts and then reading the key papers. Obviously, your library will help with this. Nowadays, it almost always involves an online search. Google can be useful, but proper search engines are better. Of course, back issues of JRA are a good place to look. In a paper, the literature review has to be more focused and specific than, say, in a graduate thesis. Typically, you might be citing 20 or 30 references, but of course, this varies a lot depending on your topic and the type of study you are conducting. A paper which is entirely a review of research may contain 100 or more references. In the end, your literature review should point to the work you are doing or want to do. Now I'll give a quick review of how to read a paper. When you get a hit in your search, the first thing you will do is to read the title. If this looks good, read the abstract. Does this contain the information that is relevant to your research? If it still looks good, go to the conclusions. You may have to download the paper to do this. These should tell you more about what the researchers found. After that, you might want to check the methods that were used, or the introduction to check the context under which the research was done, before you get into the detailed results and analysis. When you have an article or paper you're using as a reference, I suggest you make brief notes for each paper, usually just what stands out for you, as well as a note on the methodology. If using hard copy, then keep your note clipped with the paper. This will save time later when you are trying to remember who it was who said something you read that turns out to be important and needs to be quoted. And here is a time-saving tip. If you're working online, always get the full reference. It can be very irritating and often hard to find the last page number of an article when you didn't note it when you first saw the referenced article. If using hard copy, make sure the full reference is written on your copy. You may find both theoretical and experimental studies, and also reviews of research carried out by others. Ideally, you should analyse and synthesise data critically and identify gaps and misunderstandings in present scholarly knowledge. Some questions to ask. How many subjects? Were there too few for a trustworthy result? Were they selected properly to represent the population of interest? What were the limitations? Does the analysis make sense? Is the statistical analysis valid? Do the conclusions follow from the results? Does the background fit the area you are studying? It is also appropriate to critique a piece of work, e.g., unfortunately, Jones did not state how the subjects were chosen, so there is some question about the validity of his results. Of course, you should be careful about your comments. Jones might be one of your reviewers. Ideally, the lit review should include a discussion of up-to-date literature, although older papers may also be relevant. Different opinions should be included. The aim is to make a balanced and objective argument based on the existing research. You should summarise the key points relevant to your research, e.g., Jones, 2009, reported on a study of 200 women in Maine. He noted that, etc. The methodology section. The methodology simply describes what you did and how you got your results. You should try to provide a rationale or justification for your choices. For example, the choice of quantitative or qualitative approach, case study or experimental research. The same applies to your design, sampling and data collection methods. The strengths and weaknesses of different approaches reported in the introduction could be explained, leading to why you chose yours. If appropriate, you could make reference to methods used in the literature. For a study which involves surveys and statistical data, all the key parameters need to be included, such as population, survey size, response rate, choice of participants, and, briefly, how you dealt with privacy of information. You will need to explain how the data was analysed. This section is very much the practical how-to section, so that, in theory, anyone could repeat your study by following the methods you describe. Finally, you should cover any ethical issues briefly. I'm sure you will be aware of the need for approvals from an internal review board for any research involving humans or animals, or which may impact the physical environment in any way. If you are writing a reflective study involving a change in processes, how was the decision made on the intervention to make? If you had to make changes to the process after the initial start, on what basis was the intervention adjusted? What alterations were made in the course of the intervention? Unless it is trivial, you won't necessarily say why things had to change in detail. That would be a result, other than to say it was necessary. You will explain why later in the results and discussion sections. Okay, so what happened? Results should be presented clearly and concisely. Normally raw data would not be presented, but rather you will provide it in the form of a graph, table, diagram, or in a narrative. The data should be presented only once in the most effective manner. Obviously, all figures must be clearly and unambiguously labelled using the journal's instructions. Every table and figure needs to be referred to in the narrative. You are leading your reader through the data and identifying the key points. This is what your study found. As a result of changing a process, how did performance change? What was the consequence of each adjustment that you have described in the methods section? In the results, you should also discuss any problems you encountered or where you may have rejected some data, for example, and explaining why. You may have to explain the immediate outcome of a change, and then what happened if you made further changes. You would have described in the methodology section that an intervention didn't work, and so you had to alter it, but you wouldn't have said exactly what happened in that point in your paper. Don't start interpreting the results here. That comes later in the next sections. You may find that the best way to present your results will be in the form of a graph, a figure, or table. Note that only black and white graphics are allowed in the JRA. You should indicate where they need to go in the finished paper, but you need to place them at the end when you send your paper in for review. The JRA's Contributing Author Guidelines has very specific instructions on how to present figures and tables. Analysis. Once presented, you should attempt to analyse the data and explain what it is saying. Often this ends up in the same section as the results. However, I find it helps my thinking to try to separate the analysis from the results. Analysing is about interpreting the results in ways that anyone could do, rather than your personal take on the results. For example, the study found that 85% of research administrators love their job compared to only 45% of academics. This is all imaginary data, of course. Sometimes, for example, if you have a lot of data to report, you could analyse each set of data as you present them. This is something your peer advisor will help you with. Quite often, a decision about this only occurs after 2 or 3 drafts of the paper. Any statistical analysis of the data would be presented here, of course. Your discussion is where you can express views and opinions that follow from the research findings. You might want to make some further hypotheses. For example, you may say, the study showed that a happy research office turns things around faster. This suggests that managers should provide fun team activities for the staff, or other things which would make staff happier in their work. As indicated in the introduction, Jackson et al. 2015 demonstrated a number of ideas that would lead to happier offices in general. Data should be interpreted in the discussion. This interpretation includes the significance of the results and comparing them to previous study results. The discussion is where you have the chance to say what you think the results mean. You can also discuss its limitations and what further research needs to be done. Let's be honest, no research involving the social sciences is perfect, so don't be afraid to say what the limitations are. Better you than the referees. Some more things. You could suggest probable outcomes. As a result of the research, what changes could be made to government policy, business priorities, etc. Then there are impacts. How will people's lives be changed? Research administrators, researchers, society at large, and so on. I think it is also a good idea to propose ways in which the research findings could be used. This is research uptake. How could people use the results? Hopefully you've planned this from the start and involved people who could use the research, e.g. your Vice-Chancellor or the Board of Directors, and then made sure that your research addresses the issues that concern them. They will then be much more interested in your final paper. People often have trouble distinguishing between analysis and discussion. A simple way of distinguishing the two is that, again in theory, anybody could provide the same analysis given your data, while no two people would write the same discussion. Analysis is what comes straight out of your data, no need to guess. Discussion is where you can consider possibilities, why things went right or wrong, and what could be done about it, and how your results might be used. For example, an analysis might say, the change made staff happier overall, while a discussion might read, staff might have been happier if, etc. Conclusions summarise the new knowledge that has arisen from this study. Obviously, conclusions are based on the results of the study and do not necessarily represent the personal views of the author. However, you could preface a comment with, it is suggested that, etc. The conclusions are just that. It brings together the main points that have been found as a result of the study and which have already been explained in detail elsewhere in the paper. Therefore, More results or any additional analysis or discussion should most definitely not come in this section. Note that the conclusions will still contain more information than the abstract. Readers should see it as an expanded statement of the results you outlined in the abstract. Recommendations. Sometimes a research study may suggest significant new things to study or may recommend changes to the way things are done. They should be logical, practical, and creative suggestions for practice and for subsequent research. The recommendations could be part of the conclusions, although if they are particularly important, they could be in a separate section. Remember from the note earlier on how to read a paper, it should be evident that the conclusions are the most read section of your paper after the abstract. So make sure they cover your findings completely, concisely, and accurately. Of course, this works fine for a standard research study, but what about the other categories of paper that the journal accepts? The sections are all still there, but they may need to be rearranged slightly to make for a smoother flow to the paper. So, before we deal with the final sections of the paper, references, etc., let's look at how it works for a reflective inquiry. 1. The introduction now focuses on the problem addressed, and the methods and results could merge together in the section as part of the problem to be analysed. There will be a problem statement. What was the situation and what happened? Describe the experience, change, action plan, programme, etc. in detail without reflection and without immediate analysis. This gives the reader a sense of the context, problem and situation. What were the difficulties the experience caused for research administration practice and the university? Illustrate the emergence of a problem to be solved. Keep in mind the page limitations of the journal though, since you still have most of the paper to write. This means you have to stick to the relevant information and not get sidetracked into unnecessary detail of who said what to whom, for example. Another important shift could be that the bulk of the literature review will come later in the discussion section. The analysis now takes the form of your observations, extracting them from the results of the actions. Describe the behaviours observed and the author's interpretations of those behaviours during the experience, change, action plan or programme. What was the impact these behaviours seem to have had on the processes observed? You will try to be as objective and impartial as possible in this section. This is what any observer should have found. The discussion is where you evaluate and analyse the emergent concepts. This is your personal take on the situation, your evidence-based opinion. Authors should search and review the academic literature for the behaviour or behaviours the author or author's team observed during the process. In other words, connect what was observed to theoretical concepts. If the behaviours are new or seem to be new, defend your stance. Have there been similar situations that have been reported previously? Could the institution have learnt from these earlier situations to avoid some of the problems they had to deal with? 4. Your recommendations follow. You will provide recommendations for other scholars and practitioners so that the knowledge discovered in this process can be transferred to other studies or practices. The author should describe what he or she would have done differently if they were able to control the outcomes of the situation or the actions of the people involved. Similar considerations apply to the other categories. The structure is a useful guide, but not a compulsory requirement. As long as you are telling the story with beginning, middle and end, it should be fine. Next comes your reference list. All references cited in the text are listed in the references. They are arranged alphabetically, strictly following the format as specified in the instructions to authors. Programs such as the word referencing system will generally, though not entirely, produce an error-free list. Any reference in the list should also be cited in the text of the paper. This is a two-way requirement and needs a one-to-one correlation. This is not as easy to do as you might think, especially after a few edits. Okay, now let's go back to what appears at the start. We've left these until now because they are what you will write last of all, when the paper is otherwise finished. After dealing with the essentials, the paper begins with the abstract. Now, the abstract is a crucial part of your paper. It'll be used for many purposes, including displaying on the JRA website and for passing to abstract databases. Therefore, it needs to be complete in itself. If you like, you can think of it as the trailer for your paper, just like the trailer for a movie. Interesting people should want to follow up on what you have done. Therefore, it will be the most often read part of your paper. The conclusions are the second most read part, an important point to remember when you get to them. The abstract is a concise summary of all the key issues in the study. Some journals place a word limit on the abstract. For JRA there are no specific limits, but an abstract of around 350 words or less would be more than adequate. The abstract needs to include information about the background, objectives and methods, but also reports on the results, conclusions and recommendations. It should stand on its own and therefore it should not refer to any other part of the report, such as a figure or table. So, your abstract will need to capture the key points of your research from pretty well every section of the paper. And yes, you are revealing the ending of your story, but that is the key point of the sales pitch. People will want to find out how you got the conclusions, which is why they will want to get hold of the full paper and read the full developing story. So here is a simple checklist to help you to make sure you have all you need in your abstract. Immediately following the abstract, 5 to 10 keywords should be listed. You can use your own or seek advice from the web or from specialists in the area. It is a good idea to use lists of suitable keywords from various websites. Have a look at what keywords your references used. It is important to remember the keywords are used by search engines, so they need to be both specific and broad. Generic terms like education or research management are as important as more specific words. And don't forget the formatting, of course. We've left the very first items to the last. The title has to be clear and state what the paper is about. Ideally, you should aim for a title that is no longer than 12 to 15 words. However, it should have enough information so that the reader can immediately understand whether he or she needs to read further. Then there follows the basic details about you. JRA likes these to be done in a specific format. We've added the instructions at the end of this webinar, but check the author guidelines. Finally, at the end of your paper there are some things to deal with. Remember to thank any organisations that have enabled you to do the research, including your employer. You should also mention any people and colleagues who have assisted you in some substantial way, such as providing data, etc. Finally, you could, and probably should, even mention your JRA Author Fellowship Programme Peer Advisor. The JRA requires some additional material from you placed at the end of the paper. Again, see the guidelines for authors' details. This is the end of section 3. The final section will go over the submission and publication process with some useful tips for you. And as before, We would really appreciate your comments and suggestions for improvements to this webinar. Thanks for your feedback. Once done, it is time to move on to the next webinar. And again, thanks for listening. Bye for now.